November 16th, 1974, 7:14 in the morning. The phone rang in John Lennon's apartment on the Upper West Side, and he already knew what it meant before he picked it up. The number had been climbing for weeks. He had told himself, out loud to people who were listening, that it wasn't going to happen. He had been wrong. And now there was a promise sitting in the room with him, one he had made to Elton John in a recording studio 4 months earlier. One he had made because he was absolutely certain he would never have to keep it. He was 33 years old, separated from Yoko, living in a rented apartment in the city with May Pang, who had been Yoko's personal assistant before she became something else entirely. The arrangement had been unusual from the start. Yoko had suggested it herself in the autumn of 1973, during one of the strangest conversations in the already strange history of their marriage. She had sat down with May and told her that John needed someone, that she, Yoko, could not be that person right now, that May could. May had been 22 years old. She had not entirely understood what she was agreeing to. John had understood even less. They had moved to Los Angeles together in October 1973, renting a house in Santa Monica, and the Pacific Light had done nothing for either of them. Then they drifted back to New York a few months later, and somewhere in the wreckage of all that geography and confusion, something had formed between them that neither had predicted and both found difficult to name. This period had a name. John gave it one himself. He called it the Lost Weekend. It lasted 18 months. In the summer of 1974, he was at the record plant on West 44th Street, trying to build something out of the wreckage. The album was called Walls and Bridges, and it was the first record he had attempted in 2 years. He was focused when he was in the studio. Working was the one place where the noise inside his head quieted enough for him to hear himself think. He had a band, a schedule, a reason to be somewhere at a specific time. The days made sense in a way that the evenings sometimes did not. Elton John came in one afternoon in August. He was 27, at the precise peak of the kind of fame that feels like it might never end, which it always does eventually. He and John had met before and liked each other right away. And when the session started, it moved with the easy pace of two people who don't need to establish anything first. The song was Whatever Gets You Through the Night. John had written it. It was loose and confident and built around a horn section that hit in exactly the right place. Elton added backing vocals and piano, and what had started as a studio favor turned into something that felt finished the moment they wrapped it. When the session ended, Elton said it casually. "This is going to be number one." John shook his head. He didn't think so. He said so directly. Elton pressed. "If it gets to number one," he said, "you have to come on stage with me at Madison Square Garden." John looked at him for a moment. He had not performed in front of an audience in 5 years. He had no interest in doing it. He was completely certain the song would not reach the top of the charts. "Fine," he said. They shook on it. Neither of them thought it would ever become a real thing they had to act on. The song came out in September 1974 and entered the Billboard Hot 100 immediately and began moving. John watched the numbers with the specific unease of someone watching a thing they are hoping will stop. By October, it was in the top 10. By early November, it was close enough that the situation was no longer theoretical. He called Elton. "It's not going to make it," he said. Elton said nothing. He had already booked the venue. On November 16th, the song reached number one. It was John Lennon's first and only solo number one single in the United States during his lifetime. He called Elton that morning and said 4 words, "I'll be there." Then he put the phone down and sat in the apartment on the Upper West Side and understood exactly what he had just agreed to. He had 12 days. He rehearsed quietly. He chose 3 songs. The hit with Elton, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which Elton had recently covered himself, and one more, which he introduced in rehearsal with a small, private grin as something written by an old estranged fiancé of mine. Everyone in the room understood who he meant. Nobody asked whether Yoko might hear that line if she happened to be in the building that night. The question did not come up. He ran through each song a few times, made small adjustments, and kept the whole thing close to his chest. If he was nervous, he didn't perform nervousness. He just worked. He was calm during rehearsals. The people around him were not. Madison Square Garden held 20,000 people. He had played in front of 50,000 at Shea Stadium almost a decade earlier, but that was a different person in a different life. And the screaming then had been so total that he couldn't hear the music or himself or anything at all. This was different. This was him standing in a room, responsible for what came next, with no band to hide behind and no hysteria to swallow the mistakes. Thanksgiving night, November 28th, 1974. Elton's show had been running for a while when John arrived backstage. He stood in the wings in a black suit, guitar resting in his hands like something that belonged there. The crowd noise came through the walls, constant, warm, thick with the energy of 20,000 people who were exactly where they wanted to be. He had forgotten this part, the physical weight of a room that full, the way it moves through the floor and into your feet before it reaches your ears. When Elton introduced him, the sound in the building changed. Not just louder, heavier. 20,000 people recognizing a name and getting to their feet at the same time. He walked out. He raised a hand. He stepped to the microphone. And then he did the only thing he knew how to do in front of a crowd. He played. The 3 songs lasted less than 15 minutes. He got through all of them without stumbling. When he introduced the last one, he leaned into the microphone and said it was written by an old estranged fiancé of mine, and the crowd laughed the way crowds laugh when 20,000 people all understand the same thing at the same moment. He finished. He stood at the edge of the stage and took one long look at the room. Then he walked off. Backstage was the ordinary movement of people after something went well. Handshakes, voices, the collective exhale of a night that didn't go sideways. John moved through it without stopping anywhere too long. He had spent enough years in backstage corridors to know how to do that. He accepted what was offered. He said what needed to be said. And then someone came to him quietly and said something that stopped him. Yoko was in the building. She had been there the whole night. She had bought a ticket like anyone else. She had told no one she was coming. She had found a seat somewhere in those 20,000 and watched the entire show without making herself known. And now she was a few hallways away, in a back room, waiting to see if he would come. Maypang was also there. She had watched the show from a different section of the building. She had seen him walk out onto that stage, and she had seen what it did to the crowd, and she had seen, maybe more clearly than anyone else in the building, what it did to him. She had spent 18 months close enough to John Lennon to know the difference between him performing ease and him actually feeling it. What she saw on that stage was real. She knew that something about the night was significant. She was not yet certain in which direction it pointed. She would understand before the evening was over. John went to find Yoko. What happened in that room was not recorded, and no one who was nearby has put the details on the record. What they have said is that the two of them stayed in there for a long time, that no one raised their voice, that when it was over, something between them had shifted in a way that people who knew them could see plainly. They had been apart for more than a year. The distance had started to feel like a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. That night it stopped feeling that way. In January 1975, John moved back to the Dakota, back to Yoko. He stepped away from everything that wasn't that apartment and that marriage. He stopped recording. He stopped giving interviews. He learned to bake bread. He cooked. He read. He was home when Yoko told him she was pregnant, and he was home on October 9th, 1975, his own 35th birthday, when Sean was born. He stayed home after that. For 5 years, he was just a person in an apartment, raising a child, doing the quiet work of being somewhere specific rather than everywhere in general. The music press occasionally ran pieces wondering where he had gone. He had not gone anywhere. He was in the Dakota making breakfast. Elton John said later that he had never genuinely believed John would show up that Thanksgiving night. He assumed something would get in the way, an excuse, a conflict, a version of the situation that made the bet a story rather than an obligation. But John came. He kept his word. That was just John, Elton said. That was the thing about him. The recording from that night at Madison Square Garden still exists. What catches most people eventually, when they sit down and listen closely, is how unhurried John sounds. Not nervous, not reaching for anything. Like someone who stepped away from a room for a few years and came back to find it exactly where he left it. There is a moment on the tape just before the final song. The crowd is loud, and then there is a brief dip in the noise, and John leans toward the microphone and laughs. Short, real, not something put there for effect. Nobody knows exactly what crossed his mind in that second. Maybe he was thinking about the bet. Maybe he was thinking about the room a few hallways away where Yoko had been waiting. Maybe he wasn't thinking about anything in particular, which is sometimes the only reason people laugh. It is the last laugh of John Lennon's recorded live career. He was 34 years old. He had 6 years left. In 1980, he came back with a record and a set of interviews and an ease that surprised people who had known him during the Lost Weekend years. He talked about Sean, about bread, about what it felt like to have been quiet for a long time. He seemed, by most accounts, like someone who had located the place he was supposed to be and had decided to stay there. He never stood on a stage again after that night. He had kept one promise to someone who hadn't expected him to, and it had led him down a hallway and into a back room and a conversation that no one else heard and a decision that changed the remaining shape of his life. If Elton John had not pressed the point in that studio in August 1974, there is no bet. No bet, no number one call at 7:14 in the morning. No MSG, no Yoko in the building that night. No conversation in the back room. The road back to the Dakota has a completely different shape. Maybe there is no road at all, but the song hit number one. The promise was kept. 20,000 people stood in a room on a cold Thanksgiving night in New York in 1974 and heard John Lennon play 3 songs and laugh once into a microphone. And somewhere in those 20,000 seats, without a call or an announcement or a word to anyone, Yoko Ono sat alone in the dark and watched. If you were John Lennon that night, walking toward that back room not knowing what the conversation was going to cost you, only knowing that you were going to have it, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments.